Wraith's legacy. The photograph was 11 inches wide and 8 inches tall, printed in high-resolution black and white on matte paper, and it had been sitting in the center of the briefing table at Naval Base Coronado for exactly 4 minutes when Commander Callum Harker walked into the room. He was 63 years old. He had served in the United States Navy for 41 years. He had been shot twice, blown off his feet by an IED in Fallujah, and had once held a tourniquet on a man's thigh for 22 minutes in a ditch outside Kandahar, while incoming rounds chewed the mud 6 inches from his left ear. There were very few things left on Earth that stopped Callum Harker cold. He looked at the photograph for 9 seconds without moving. Then he sat down. The image showed a single security camera frame, timestamped 013, 4 hours, taken from a remote sensor positioned at the eastern perimeter of a compound in the high desert along the Nevada-Idaho border. The frame had been enhanced, sharpened, pushed through 3 different image processing filters before being printed and placed on this table. Even with all of that work, the image was still dark, still grainy, still difficult to read in the way that nighttime surveillance footage always was. But Harker could see what was in it. Anyone who had spent enough time looking at this kind of imagery could see what was in it. A woman, small frame, maybe 5'3", maybe 120 pounds, fully equipped. She was on a vertical rock face 80 feet off the desert floor in complete darkness, with no rope, no equipment, no visible anchor of any kind. Her right hand was pressed into a crack in the rock above her head. Her left foot was extended to a ledge that couldn't have been more than 2 inches wide. She was carrying a pack on her back and something over her left shoulder that the analysts had identified as a wounded person. An adult male, probably 180, being carried up an 80-foot rock face in the dark by a woman who weighed 120 pounds. At the bottom of the photograph, in small block letters, someone had typed a name. Voss Nora, civilian, no combat record on file. Harker looked at the name for a long time. Then he said quietly to the empty room, Thomas. The briefing would start in 20 minutes. The room would fill with people who would have questions Harker wasn't sure he could answer. But right now, in these 4 minutes before anyone else arrived, he allowed himself to sit with what he was looking at. A woman who had climbed an unclimbable wall in the dark while carrying a wounded man and 3 encrypted hard drives. A woman the database said had no combat record. A woman whose name he had heard exactly once before, spoken by a man who was supposed to have been dead for 13 years. He allowed himself exactly those 4 minutes. Then he straightened in his chair, folded his hands on the table, and waited. Rewind 72 hours. The women's locker room at Naval Base Coronado had been completed 14 months ago as part of a facility upgrade. The paint on the interior walls was still slightly too new, still carrying that faint chemical smell that said this space had not yet absorbed enough human history to feel like it belonged to anyone. The fluorescent lights hummed at a frequency you couldn't quite hear, but could always feel somewhere behind your eyes. Commander Callum Harker had no business being in that room. He knew it the moment he pushed the door open at 0527 hours. He had been looking for Master Chief Decker, had been told Decker was near the East Wing, had taken a wrong turn in the pre-dawn darknesses of a base he had navigated for the better part of 4 decades. A wrong turn. 41 years at Coronado, and he had taken a wrong turn. He would understand later that wrong turns sometimes were how you found the things that changed everything. The room was empty except for one person. She was standing with her back to the door, maybe 15 feet away, facing a bank of lockers. She had removed her shirt. She was holding it in both hands, the fabric bunched at her waist, the way someone holds a garment when they're about to pull it over their head, and then stopped, interrupted by some private thought. The locker room was quiet. She hadn't heard him come in. Harker was a professional. He had spent 4 decades operating in environments where modesty was a luxury nobody could afford. What he noticed in the first second was not what a different kind of man might have noticed. What he noticed was the tattoo. It covered her entire back shoulder blade to shoulder blade, the base of her neck to the small of her back. His first impression was scale. His second impression was precision. This was not the work you found in a shop near a military base, not the tribal patterns or the motivational Latin phrases that young sailors got to mark the person they believed they were becoming. This was something else entirely. It was a trident, but not the standard naval special warfare insignia, not the design that appeared on dress uniforms and challenge coins in the walls of every SEAL team building in the country. This was an older design, a variant that had existed for exactly 1 year before being standardized away. The eagle's wings were wider, the spread of them carrying a weight that the current design had smoothed into something more manageable. The anchor's flukes were sharper. The pistol barrel was longer. The entire piece had the quality of something created before anyone had decided what it was supposed to look like, before committees and regulations had filed the edges down. Harker had seen this design 9 times in his life. 7 of the men who had carried it were dead. One had lost both legs in a training exercise in the late 90s. One had been listed as killed in action during a training accident at Fort Bragg, North Carolina in March of 1984. Below the trident in lettering that was precise and clean and utterly without decoration, someone had written 2 words in a year, Voss 1981, and below that smaller 2 letters, TV. Harker's left hand found the doorframe. He gripped it without being aware he did so. The woman turned. She turned the way a person turns when they have been aware of someone's presence for some time and have simply decided to wait and see what happens next. There was no surprise in it, no alarm. She looked at him with eyes that were gray in the fluorescent light, a gray that reminded him of February mornings at sea, flat and clear, and capable of seeing a great deal. She was 28 or somewhere near it. Her face carried the marks of someone who had spent considerable time outdoors in weather. She pulled the tactical shirt over her head with practiced efficiency that managed to be neither rushed nor deliberately slow. "You going to stand there all morning, Commander?" It was not quite a question. His mouth worked once without producing sound. He looked at his hand on the door frame and made it let go. "That tattoo," he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "Where did you get it?" She began buttoning the shirt from the bottom. She was in no hurry. "From the only person who had the right to give it to me." "That design," Harker said. He took one step into the room. "It was authorized for 8 operators. I knew all 8 personally. 7 are dead. The 8th was listed as killed at Fort Bragg," she said. "March 14th, 1984. Training accident. I know the official record." "Then you know what you're claiming is impossible." She looked at him for a moment. Then she touched her shoulder where the letters were below the trident, where they sat, now beneath 2 layers of tactical fabric. "Thomas Voss," she said. "Does that name mean anything to you, Commander?" The folder Harker had been carrying dropped from his fingers. He heard it hit the floor. He did not look down at it. He looked at her. And for the first time in a very long time, Commander Callum Harker did not know what to say next. The sensitive, compartmented information facility at Coronado sat at the center of the building like a heart inside a chest. No windows. Concrete walls poured thick enough to absorb sound and signal both. A magnetic door lock requiring a key card, a biometric scan, and a 4-digit code that changed every 24 hours. Inside a steel table, 4 steel chairs, a flat screen mounted on the far wall, and the particular silence that exists only in places where serious things are decided. Harker brought them all. Master Chief Colt Decker at 62 was built for the room. 6 feet of compact, concentrated purpose, with the physical density of someone who had never in his adult life permitted himself to be soft. He had more confirmed long-range shots than years of service, a statistic that sounded impossible until you met him and understood that it wasn't. He sat at the table with his arms crossed and his expression set to a professional skepticism he used on bad intel, faulty equipment, and anything else that promised more than it could deliver. Senior Chief Aldous Pruitt at 55 was the quiet one. He had been the quiet one for as long as anyone on the base could remember, long enough that people had stopped noticing it as a characteristic and absorbed it as a fact of the environment, the way you absorb the sound of the ocean or the weight of the Pacific wind. He found a position near the corner of the room and settled into it without a word. Chief Gareth Landis at 57 had the face of a man who had seen enough of the world's cruelty to find peace in small rituals. He carried worn rosary beads in his left breast pocket, had for 20 years, and moved them through his fingers in any moment of waiting with the automatic ease of a private arrangement made long ago with something larger than himself. He took a chair at the table and waited. Nora Voss stood near the door with her arms crossed. At 5'3" in a room with these men, she should have seemed small. She did not seem small. Harker sealed the door and stood at the head of the table. "This is Nora Voss," he said, "granddaughter of Thomas Voss." The silence that followed was the silence of people who have just heard something their professional training is telling them cannot be true. Decker spoke first. Thomas Voss had no family in his file, no next of kin, no documented relationships. "His file was altered," Nora said. "His death was staged. He lived another 27 years in Larimer County, Colorado, and later in rural Montana. He died in 2011. A car accident on Route 230 miles east of Havre. It wasn't an accident." "Prove it," Decker said. She pulled a photograph from her cargo pocket and set it on the table. Decker leaned in. The image was a 4 by 6 color print, slightly faded, the kind handled many times and kept somewhere it was cared for. It showed a girl of about 13 standing beside a man in his late 60s in front of a log structure with a mountain range behind it. The man held a rifle at a downward angle, and the girl mirrored his stance with the focused seriousness of a student determined to get it right. The man's face was weathered past what his age alone would have required, carved by exposure to things the body remembers even when the mind tries to move past them. There was a scar through his left eyebrow. Decker's jaw went tight. "The rifle," he said. His voice had changed register by half a step. "That's a Remington 700 with a custom stock. I've seen that stock." He tapped the photograph without touching the image itself. "Left side near the first sling swivel. There's a notch in the wood." "Shrapnel," Nora said. "Point Salines Airfield, Grenada, October 25th, 1983. He told me the story 43 times. He said repetition built the kind of memory that doesn't fade when things get difficult." Decker sat back, his arms uncrossed. Aldous Pruitt, from his corner, looked at the photograph once. Then he looked at the wall. Something in his expression settled into a quality that was not quite recognition and not quite decision, but occupied the territory between them. Without being asked, without explanation, he crossed to Nora and held out his hand. She looked at him for a moment, then passed him the photograph. He studied it carefully and returned it. Whatever he had needed to confirm, he had confirmed. Landis touched the rosary beads in his pocket. Harker looked at Nora. "The Colorado cabin. When was that taken?" "Summer of 2009. I was 13. He was teaching me windage calculation at altitude." She paused. "He said the best shooters learn to read the air before they learn to read the instruments." Harker breathed out slowly through his nose. Thomas had said almost those exact words to him, standing on the deck of a training facility in the California summer heat in 1982, a year and a half before his supposed death. Harker had not forgotten. Some memories don't leave. They just go somewhere quiet and wait. The flat screen on the wall came to life. Deputy Director Marin Crane of the Central Intelligence Agency appeared on the screen with the kind of background that said secure government facility and the expression of someone who had not arrived at her position by waiting for others to decide what needed to happen. She was in her early 50s, hair pulled back, eyes carrying the sharpness of a person who had spent decades being 3 steps ahead of events and had learned not to feel satisfied by it because satisfaction created lag. "Gentlemen," she said, "Miss Voss, I've been read into this situation. I'll be brief." She did not ask if there were questions. She began. 6 men were dead, all former members of SEAL Team 6. All had been present in various operational roles during a classified extraction mission in Panama in November of 1987, a mission that ended with 9 American operators dead in a street outside Panama City because the intelligence underpinning it had been deliberately falsified. The investigation that followed concluded with no charges filed, no source identified, and a classified finding sealed so thoroughly it had effectively ceased to exist within institutional memory. Now someone was killing everyone who had been there. The signature was consistent. 338 Lapua Magnum round fired from between 800 and 1,200 yards. Professional placement. No secondary evidence, no witnesses. The intervals between kills were shortening. 4 months for the first 4, 3 weeks for the 5th and 6th. "We believe," Crane said, "that the individual coordinating these eliminations is operating from a facility in the high desert along the Nevada-Idaho border. We further believe this individual is in the final stages of completing a transaction involving what is known internally as the archive." She paused for exactly the weight the pause required. 35 years of classified American special operations material, black budget operations, unacknowledged missions, intelligence assets cover identities, source networks. A record of things that were never supposed to be written down, but were. Material that could, in the wrong hands and careers, topple institutions and compromise individuals in positions of current federal authority. The room was very quiet. "You want us to go get it," Harker said. "I want you to stop a transaction 11 days from completion," Crane said. "The archive and the individual selling it." She looked at each of them in turn. "This is your operation, your team, your call in the field." The screen went dark. Decker looked at Nora. "The girl," he said, not unkindly, simply as a statement of the open variable in the room. Harker surprised himself with the certainty in his voice. "She proves herself, same as anyone else, wants to." He looked at Nora. "You want on this team, you show me what Thomas gave you." She looked back at him. "Name the test," she said. "I'll pass it." The 1,000-yard range at the eastern edge of the base sat in flat morning light with the silence large open spaces have when the wind drops. The Pacific was invisible from here, but present in everything, in the quality of the air, in the faint brine underneath every breath, in the way the heat shimmer rose off the sand with a restlessness that said the ocean was not far and the atmosphere knew it. 3 targets downrange. Man-sized silhouettes, the kind that had absorbed the intentions of thousands of trained men and given back honest results. Decker set up first. He moved with the economy of a man who has performed the same sequence of actions so many times that the actions have migrated out of thought and into the body. The Barrett M82 was a 50 caliber instrument of such straightforward authority that it reduced most questions about distance to arithmetic. Decker adjusted his position behind the stock with 3 small movements, checked the wind gauge at the range marker, noted 22 miles per hour from the northwest with variable gusts, noted the temperature at 94 degrees, and the heat shimmer rising in waves that would affect bullet path beyond 700 yards. He breathed twice. 5 rounds in just under 2 minutes. Downrange 3 solid center mass impacts, 2 within 4 inches of center. In any other context, this would have been the end of the conversation. In 40 years of doing this professionally, Decker had produced such results so consistently that they had stopped being impressive to anyone who worked with him and had become the baseline definition of what professional looked like. He stood, wiped his forehead with the back of his wrist, said nothing, stepped back. Nora approached the rifle. She did not touch it immediately. She walked around the shooting position in a slow circle, the way someone walks around terrain. They're trying to understand from multiple angles. She looked at the wind gauge. She looked at the heat shimmer downrange. She knelt on one knee and pressed her right palm flat against the desert floor. Fingers spread and held it there for a long time. Landis, standing to Harker's left, said quietly, "What is she doing?" "Reading it," Harker said, and he felt something move through him he did not immediately identify. He identified it a moment later. Memory. He had watched Thomas Voss do exactly this, in exactly this posture, on exactly this kind of range in the last summer before everything changed. Reading the ground before reading the air. Said you had to understand what was below you before you could trust what was above you. Nora settled behind the Barrett. Her frame looked against the weapon like a question the weapon hadn't expected. But her hands moved on the stock, in the grip, in the adjustment controls with the ease of long habit. Not the familiarity of someone who has read about a thing or been instructed in a thing, but of someone who has done it so many times the motions have become conversation. She found her eye position behind the scope. She went still. Not the stillness of effort or concentration. The stillness of someone who had arrived somewhere they recognized. The first round cracked across the range. Downrange, the spotting scope showed the silhouette's head had ceased to exist in any coherent form. Decker made a sound that was not quite a word. 3 seconds. The second round, same result. Third, fourth, fifth, each impact in the same location on each of the 3 targets distributed across the full width of the range, accounting for the crosswind variation that Decker had managed, but not eliminated, that the heat shimmer made unpredictable, that the equipment had not been adjusted for. Each impact was a headshot. The full string of 5 rounds took 41 seconds. The range went very quiet. Pruitt, from his position near the rear, said nothing, but he nodded once slowly, the way someone nods when they have seen something confirmed they had already quietly believed. Decker did not speak for a long moment. When he did, his voice carried something between awe and unease that made both labels feel insufficient. "I've been doing this for 38 years, he said. "I have never seen anything like that." "That's not training," Harker said quietly. "That's 30 years of practice with a man who had nothing else to do and every reason in the world to make sure she could take care of herself." He walked to Nora, extended his hand. "Welcome to the team," he said. "Call sign Wraith. Your grandfather would recognize it." She shook his hand. Her grip was what her grip was. Her palm had calluses in the places that years of specific work create calluses. Her gray eyes did not change expression. "Don't celebrate yet, Commander," she said. "We haven't done anything yet." She was right. She said it the way people say things they know are true and have no interest in softening. That night, Harker found her in the armory. It was 2240 hours. The room smelled of oil and metal and the institutional neutrality of a space that existed entirely for purpose. Nora was at the workbench field stripping an M4 with methodical attention that had nothing performative about it. She did not start when he came in. She had heard him in the hallway. He pulled a stool from the wall and sat with a distance between them that said this was a conversation, not a debrief. He picked up an oiled cloth and a disassembled barrel and gave his hands something to do. Thomas, he said, the last time I saw him in person, it was a hospital in Portsmouth, spring of 1984. He'd been injured in a training exercise, or so the record said. I visited him before the transfer to the long-term care facility. He paused. A week later, I was told he had died of complications. I thought I had already said goodbye and hadn't known it. The armory was quiet. I was with him for the last 2 years of his life, Nora said. 2009 to 2011. Before that, I'd seen him every summer since I was 8. He came to us. My mother knew who he was, knew why he was gone. She never talked about it, and he never explained, and I learned not to ask. What was he like at the end? She set a component down on the cloth. Careful, always checking exits. He couldn't sleep with less than 2 points of egress, accessible from wherever he was lying. Some nights I'd wake up at 2 in the morning and find him sitting on the porch with a rifle across his knees, just watching the darkness at the edge of the property. She paused. But patient in a way most people aren't. He'd spend 4 hours teaching me one thing and never seemed like he'd rather be anywhere else. What did he teach you? Everything he knew. She reassembled the weapon with practiced speed, checked the action, set it down. He said being small meant being underestimated, and underestimation was the most useful tool a person could have because people don't guard against what they don't see coming. Harker was quiet for a moment. He said almost that exact thing to me once. 1982, standing on the deck outside the training facility on a Tuesday afternoon. I was a Lieutenant JG who thought he knew more than he did. Did he fix that? He tried. Some of it stuck. Nora almost smiled. It was a very small thing. It passed quickly. Harker set the cloth down and reached for his vest. He removed a journal worn the cover dark with years of handling. Before I turn in, I need to read through this. He looked at her. His journal. You gave me the copy. Read all of it, she said, including the margins. He looked at her for a moment, then carried it back to his office. He read it cover to cover, standing at his desk with the door locked. The entries jumped through years. 1979, when Thomas was still learning his profession, the observations careful and technical, and marked with a young man's certainty that everything was learnable if you looked at it long enough. 1981, the formation of the team, the first mention of names that would become familiar. 1983, Grenada Harker's own name appearing in a passage that made the back of his throat tighten. 1987, Panama, and the 9 pages that followed, written in a hand that had changed, that had compressed itself into something smaller and more controlled, the way handwriting changes when the person behind it is managing something they cannot afford to show. He turned to page 31 from the 1979 section. The entry itself was brief, a young operator's observation about a training exercise in Georgia. But in the margin, written in ink that was a slightly different shade than the surrounding text clearly added, at a different time, perhaps years later, Thomas had written a sequence of 6 numbers in a single word in handwriting that was smaller and more careful than his usual style. The kind of handwriting you use when you are being precise about something you cannot afford to get wrong. Harker did not understand the notation. It had the structure of a reference, a file number perhaps, or a grid coordinate that didn't match any standard military format he could place. He moved on. He found the last page. October 12, 2011, 19 days before Route 2. 5 names, his own among them. He stood with the journal in his hands and understood what it meant that Thomas had written his name on that list, and what it meant that Thomas had not been able to narrow it further before the truck without its lights came out of a side road and ended the investigation. He understood that the woman in the armory down the hall had read this page and made a decision about how to handle what she found on it, and that the decision she had made was not to run, but to stay and watch and wait for the answer to reveal itself through proximity. He stood there for a long time. Then he walked back to the armory. She was still at the workbench, though the disassembled weapon had been replaced by a different one. She looked up when he came in, but said nothing. "You've read this page," he said. 3 years ago, she said, "when I decided to come forward. Why tell me? Because if you're not the one Thomas suspected, you deserve to know what we're walking into." Her hand did not move toward her sidearm, but something in her posture clarified in a way that communicated the same information. "And if you are, Thomas didn't raise someone who looks the other way." Callum Harker stood in the armory door for a moment. "He didn't," Harker agreed. "Get some sleep, boss." He walked out. Behind him, in the quiet room that smelled of oil and purpose and the weight of things not yet finished, Nora Voss looked down at the journal. She closed it, held it for a moment, put it back inside her vest against her chest, where it had been for 3 years. Then she turned off the light and went to prepare for what came next. Part 2. What the ground remembers. The convoy left Coronado at 0900 hours in 3 civilian vehicles: a gray Ford F-250, a black Tahoe, and a white Ram 1500 with a livestock company logo on the doors that belonged to nobody in the livestock business. They drove northeast through the San Diego Basin and into the Mojave, and then north and east through country that had been asking hard questions of the people who crossed it for 10,000 years. The desert in October at this latitude had a quality of light that made distances difficult to estimate and made you understand why the people who had always lived here had developed a different relationship with space than people who grew up in places that had trees. Nobody talked much. Harker drove the lead truck, Nora rode passenger. In the back seat, Senior Chief Aldous Pruitt sat with his hands in his lap and looked out the window with the expression of a man reading something written in a language most people couldn't see. The second vehicle carried Decker and Landis. The equipment was distributed across all 3 trucks so that no single vehicle was a complete loss if something happened to it. They stopped once outside Wells, Nevada at a truck stop with a subway and a rack of postcards showing landscapes nobody was going to mail to anyone. Harker got coffee, Decker got coffee, Pruitt got water. Landis stood in the parking lot with his face tilted toward a sky so blue it looked structural, moved the rosary beads through his fingers 3 times, and got back in the vehicle without explanation. After 20 years, nobody found this remarkable. Nora stood by the lead truck and looked at the map on her phone with the attention of someone checking work she had already done 3 times and wanted to check a 4th time, not because she doubted it, but because certainty at this level was earned through repetition. Harker came and stood beside her with his coffee. 22 miles from the staging point, she said. We go to ground at the base of the Copper Range and trek in on foot. The facility is in a bowl between 2 ridgelines. The northern approach looks like the obvious line of advance. That's why we're not using it. What's the eastern approach? A rock face, 80 feet. No visible anchor points from any surveillance angle. Harker drank his coffee and said nothing. He used to take me climbing in Rocky Mountain National Park, Nora said. Every summer from when I was 9 until I was 15. He said the most important thing a person could know was how to move through terrain that others had decided was impassable. She looked up from the phone. He was specific about that word. Decided. He said impassable was always a decision, never a fact. Harker crushed the empty cup and put it in the trash can. Let's go, he said. Before they loaded back into the vehicles, Harker pulled Landis aside. A brief exchange quiet enough that the others caught only the shape of it. Harker was asking Landis to run the southern reconnaissance on the vehicle compound when they reached the ridgeline. He wanted a precise count on the armored vehicles and a timing read on the loading dock rotation. Landis nodded, said he'd work around the perimeter and meet them at the rally point. Nora watched this from the far side of the truck. She filed it. She would come back to it. They left the vehicles at a staging point 4 miles from the compound in a dry wash behind a ridgeline that would keep them invisible from aerial surveillance. The equipment came out of the trucks in an order that said this team had done this sequence many times in many places. No wasted motion, no commentary. They moved out at 2140 hours. The Great Basin at night in October had a cold that was not gradual. It arrived with the dark, and it meant business. The temperature had been 91 degrees at the truck stop. It was now 54 and dropping, and the wind from the northwest carried the information that it had traveled a long distance over very cold ground to get here. Nora was on point. She moved through the terrain the way she had moved through the rifle range, reading it, working with the information it provided in real time. Every 30 meters she paused, listened, assessed. The 3 men behind her adjusted their pace to hers without discussion, which was the highest form of professional acknowledgement available in the field. None of them commented on it. An hour into the approach, she stopped. Her right fist came up, closed. The column went still. She went to one knee, brought her night vision down, and scanned the terrain at a low angle, looking for things at ground level. Harker moved up beside her. She pointed. In the green wash of the night vision, he could make out the monofilament wire, knee-high strung between 2 scrub junipers, nearly invisible against the pale desert floor. It ran to a shadow on the right side with the wrong geometry, too compact, too deliberate. He leaned close to her ear. IED. She nodded. Then she looked at the pattern of it. Not just the device, but the whole arrangement, the placement of the anchoring trees, the angle of the wire, the location of the secondary she had already identified from the shadow geometry on the opposite side 23 meters back, an offset to channel a reacting force into a kill zone positioned behind a shallow rise that looked like cover, but wasn't. She looked at all of it for 15 seconds. Then she turned to him, and he could see from her expression in the green light that something had shifted inside her, something she was working to keep off her face and not entirely succeeding. He raised his eyebrows, a question. She shook her head slightly. Not now, later. She plotted a bypass route on her GPS, marked the device's location with a waypoint, and led them wide around the position with a margin that took an extra 20 minutes and an extra half-mile of difficult terrain. Nobody complained. They came back on course and continued. But Harker watched the back of her head as they moved and understood that what he had seen in her expression was not fear. It was recognition of something she had not expected to find here, and the recognition had shaken her in a way she was managing but had not resolved. He filed it. He would come back to it. The ridgeline overlooking the compound gave them the view that intelligence briefings described as excellent in operational reality usually failed to deliver. This time it delivered. The facility below sat in a bowl between two natural ridges, which gave it excellent protected approaches from every conventional direction. 3 buildings. The central structure was a converted ranch house, substantially reinforced with a modern communications antenna array on the roof that had nothing to do with ranch operations. 2 outbuildings to the east and south, a vehicle compound with 6 trucks, visible 3 of them, military pattern. Perimeter lighting at the corners creating overlapping pools with very few genuine shadow lanes. Guard movement was coordinated. Professional interval spacing. These were not hired hands. Harker settled behind his spotting scope. Decker went prone beside him, the Barrett staged for rapid assembly, scanning through his own glass. Pruitt had gone to ground 20 meters right with a silence that made him effectively invisible. Landis had departed for the southern angle on the vehicle compound 40 minutes prior, as planned, working around the perimeter. Nora was on her stomach beside Harker, her scope up, doing the work. Patrol rotation is 28 minutes, she said, barely more than air moving past teeth. Guard Tower East has a gap at the far end of the rotation. 40 seconds. The camera on the eastern wall covers the lower face of the cliff, but the mounting angle creates a blind spot above 30 feet. She paused. The cliff face is outside the primary defensive design. They don't think it's unclimbable. They think it's not worth covering. That's what we're using, Harker said. That's what I'm using. He looked at her. Negative. We don't split the team. We're already split, she said. One of us is the reason they know their defensive patterns match information that only exists in Thomas's journal. One of us read those pages. She did not look away from her scope. I've been watching all 4 of them since we left Coronado. I don't know which one it is yet. But until I do, splitting is not a tactical choice. It's the only choice that keeps the mission alive. The argument she was making was correct. He hated that it was correct. He sat with the correctness of it and understood that there was no version of this where he got to simply disagree. You go wired, he said, full comms the entire time. The moment you go dark, I pull everyone and we extract. Agreed. And you take this. He reached to his vest and removed something he had carried in the same interior pocket for close to 40 years. A fixed blade knife with a handle worn smooth by decades of use, and a blade that had been sharpened so many times the profile had changed slightly from its original geometry. He held it out. Thomas gave this to me in October of 1983. Grenada. He pulled it out of a soldier who was about to put it in me. Said it was luckier to give than to keep. A pause. He was right. 3 times that I can name. Nora took the knife. She looked at it in the starlight for a moment. Then she slid it into her boot sheath without ceremony, which was exactly the right response. Observation before you go, Pruitt said from his position 20 meters right. Everyone looked at him. It was the most he had said in 12 hours. He was looking at the compound through his glass, not at them. The IED placement, the patrol pattern, the coverage gaps in the way the secondary positions are layered. A pause. I've seen this doctrine before. Not in any manual, not in any training cycle. Another pause. It's from Thomas's last journal, the tactical section he wrote in 2010, the one he marked as personal instruction. The desert was very quiet. How do you know what's in Thomas's journal? Nora said. Pruitt lowered his glass. Because he sent me a copy in 2010. Said if something happened to him, someone on the inside needed to know what he knew. He looked at her steadily. He trusted me before he trusted anyone else. That was his choice, not mine to explain. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then someone accessed your copy, Harker said. Or his, Pruitt said. I've been trying to work out which since we found the first IED. The wind moved across the ridgeline. Harker looked at Nora. 40 seconds on that tower rotation. You'll have a window in 11 minutes. She checked her watch. Began her final equipment check. One thing, Decker said. She looked at him. He held her gaze with an expression that had traveled a long distance from where it had started 3 days ago in the SCIF. Come back, he said. 2 words. In the context of everything, they carried the weight of a much longer speech. She nodded once. Moved out. The cliff face was exactly what it had looked like from the ridgeline. 80 feet of layered desert stone, the lower 30 offering decent purchase, the upper section growing increasingly technical. In daylight with equipment, a competent climber could manage it in under 10 minutes. In darkness without equipment, wearing a full tactical load with a pack on her back, it was a different conversation. Nora had that conversation with the rock for 31 minutes. She moved the way Thomas had taught her across a dozen Colorado summers, the way she had internalized so completely it had stopped being technique and become instinct. 3 points of contact at all times. Read the rock before you weight it. Trust the small holds because the large ones lie. Breathe on the rest. Never look down, not because it's frightening, but because it gives you information you can't use and costs you attention you can't spare. At 20 feet, her left foot slipped on a section of face that looked solid and was not. For 1 second, she hung from 2 points of contact in the dark 80 feet above a desert floor that would not forgive the mistake. Her body did what training had made it do, finding the next hold, without panic, without the internal commentary that failure generates in people who have not trained failure into submission. Her foot found purchase. She rested for 3 breaths. Wraith status, Harker's voice in her earpiece controlled. Moving, she said, stay off the channel. She kept climbing. At 50 feet, voices above her from the guard walk along the compound's eastern wall. She pressed flat against the face and slowed her breathing to something that wouldn't register as sound from 10 feet away. The voices moved. Boots on gravel, the scrape of a bored guard walking a route he had walked so many times it required nothing from him. The smell of cigarette smoke drifted down. She waited. Counted to 20 after the footsteps faded. Then climbed the last 30 feet. She came over the wall in the gap between camera coverage and active guard position with the economy of someone who had been planning this exact movement for the last hour. Dropped to a crouch on the interior walkway. Assessed, east courtyard below, largely empty, a single guard at the vehicle compound gate with his back turned. Service door to the main structure 30 meters across, open ground, recessed in shadow. She crossed the courtyard in 11 seconds and pressed herself against the wall beside the service door. Locked. She pulled her pick set and had the mechanism open in 38 seconds. The door swung inward on recently oiled hinges, which told her something about how this facility was maintained. She stepped through and eased it shut behind her. The interior hallway was dim and smelled of concrete and industrial solvent. She oriented herself. Main structure, ground floor, eastern end. The basement would be below and toward the center. She found a stairwell and went down. The basement corridor was colder by 8 degrees and darker by half. She moved along it with her rifle indexed and her breathing controlled. 3 doors on the left side closed. 2 on the right went open to a generator room. At the end of the corridor, a steel door with a reinforced frame and a keypad entry currently unlit, meaning it was either off or open from inside. She pressed herself against the wall beside it and listened. Voices, 3 of them, one in Russian accented English. One in the flat controlled American English of someone who had spent enough time in institutional settings to have the regionality trained out of their speech. And a third, she knew the third voice. She had heard it for 4 days. In the SCIF and in the briefing room and in the field. She had heard it move the rosary beads through its fingers and say careful, quiet things at exactly the right moments. Gareth Landis, not on the southern perimeter running a vehicle count. Inside the compound. In the basement. At the heart of it. She had known, when Harker tasked him for the southern recon, that she needed to watch whether Landis actually went south. She had let him go ahead and then circled wide enough to catch his heading in her night vision before committing to the cliff approach. She had seen him deviate, had watched him find a secondary entrance. She hadn't been briefed on a maintenance hatch on the compound's western wall that sat in the one blind spot between guard tower rotations. She had filed it, had continued to the cliff, had understood in the way you understand things you were already most of the way toward knowing what his heading meant. Now she listened through the door and confirmed it. Position confirmation, Landis was saying. His voice was completely level, the same voice he used for everything. Harker, Decker, and Pruitt are on the north ridgeline. Approach vector is north and east. They'll move on the main structure at 0400. A pause. Then the flat American voice and the girl. Separate approach, eastern wall most likely. She'll be inside the compound by now. Find her. I'm working on it. Nora had already keyed her mic. Harker. She kept her voice to a minimum of sound. It's Landis. He's inside the compound. He's given them your position. North Ridge Line 0400. Displace now. I say again, displace now. 3 seconds of silence. Then Harker's voice stripped of everything except the operational core. Copy, displacing. What is your status? She opened her mouth to answer. The safety clicked off behind her head. Hands, said a voice. Close. Professional distance. Not close enough to reach without turning. Both of them where I can see them. She complied. Her hands came up and out. Radio, left hand. 2 fingers. Drop it. The radio hit the concrete floor. Rifle, same procedure. The M4 joined the radio. Sidearm, boot knife. She removed them in the order specified and placed them on the floor. Turn around. She turned. The man facing her was compact, mid-40s, with the physical bearing of someone who had not stopped training when they left whatever service had built them. He held a suppressed pistol in a 2-handed grip that was neither aggressive nor casual. He had been waiting in this corridor, which meant the entry point she had believed was undetected had been watched. She filed this alongside what Landis had said about her eastern approach. The implications moved through her thinking in the 2 seconds she had before the man gestured toward the steel door. Inside, he said, they're expecting you. The door opened from within as she reached it. She walked through. The room beyond was large and concrete-walled, fluorescent lit. A folding table in the center bearing hard drives, a laptop, stacked documents in labeled folders. 3 men standing. The first was Alexei Rudov. Shorter than the intelligence briefing photos had suggested, with a face that indicated cruelty was not something he had to work at. The second was Gareth Landis. He looked at her with something that was not quite guilt and not quite apology, but occupied the territory where both of those things failed to materialize in a person who made a fundamental decision about their own interests a very long time ago. The third was an older man, late 60s, silver hair cut short and still military. He wore a dark suit and wore it with the absolute authority of someone who had decided it was armor. He was tall, maybe 6'2", and he moved when he turned to look at her with the careful economy of a man who had learned decades ago that every movement was information. She recognized him from the briefing photograph taken in 1989. The last photograph in the official record before the record ended, Admiral Beckett Fisk, carried in a casket at Camp Pendleton in March of 1991, mourned and buried and filed under the permanent category of men who no longer needed to be worried about. Miss Voss, he said. His voice was the flat American English she had heard through the door. Up close, it carried a quality of total control that said the man behind it had not lost his composure in a very long time. I've been waiting to meet you since 2011, since Thomas's accident. He said the word with the neutrality of a man referencing a historical event. Sit down, we have a great deal to discuss. She remained standing. He looked at her for a moment. Thomas was remarkable, he said. Stubborn, patient, genuinely intelligent in the way very few people are, which is to say he was intelligent about things that mattered and unbothered by things that didn't. He paused. Let's see whether you inherited his limitations or simply his skills. Landis looked at the floor. Tell her, Fisk said to him, you've earned that much. Landis looked up. He met her eyes, which was more than she had expected. I told them everything, he said. The approach, the timing, your route. His voice was steady in the way things are steady when a person has already moved past the phase where steadiness requires effort. You were never going to come out of this. None of you were. Why, she said. Money, he said, as if the word were both a complete answer and a complete explanation. 20 years of watching men with less skill and less sacrifice accumulate the things I didn't have because I believed the institution would take care of its own. He shook his head slightly. It doesn't. It never did. Fisk offered me a future. The Navy offered me a salary and a ceremony. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Fisk said, now, Thomas's journal, the complete notes on the Archangel investigation. What does it contain beyond what we already have, and where is the copy you're carrying? She said nothing. Fisk pulled the laptop toward him and turned the screen so she could see it. A live feed from a thermal camera positioned to cover the ridgeline to the north of the compound. 3 heat signatures moving fast through the terrain, and behind them on the edges of the frame, multiple other signatures converging from 2 directions. Harker, Decker, Pruitt, running, being followed. They have perhaps 4 minutes before the outer containment closes on them, Fisk said. 4 minutes is enough time if I give the order to stand down for them to reach their vehicles. Or it's enough time for 3 men to die in a dry wash in the Nevada desert with no witnesses and no record. She looked at the screen. Tell me what's in the journal, he said, and I call off the pursuit. The room waited. Nora looked at the thermal feed and calculated. 4 minutes. She thought about what Thomas had taught her about this kind of moment, not the tactical version, but the earlier one, the one from the porch of the Montana house in the last summer before everything ended. He had said the moment the enemy needs something from you is the moment you stop being their problem and start being their obstacle. Obstacles require solutions. Solutions take time. Time is the only currency that actually matters. She let her shoulders drop slightly. She let something move across her face that resembled the expression of a person arriving at a decision they have been trying to avoid. All right, she said quietly. All right, call them off. I'll tell you what's in the journal. Fisk looked at her with the expression of a man who recognized a capitulation when he saw one. He reached for the radio on the table, and in the space of that reach between the decision and the execution, Nora Voss moved. Thomas's knife was in her left boot. She had kept her left hand at her side for the last 90 seconds, calculating the distance to Rudolph and the time required in the window created by the moment when the person you are watching reaches for something other than a weapon. The reach for the radio was that window. She crossed the distance to Rudolph in 2 steps. He was turning. Too slow. The knife took him in the throat with the precision of someone who had been taught by a man who understood that the difference between a tool and a weapon was intention, and intention required both knowledge and the willingness to use it. The guard behind her fired twice. Suppressed the shot sounded like someone clapping their hands hard, twice close to her ears. The rounds cracked past her close enough that the air displacement was physical. She was already dropping, already reaching for the pistol in Rudolph's holster as he fell, already moving toward the corner of the table. Landis drew his weapon. She was faster. The Makarov she'd taken from Rudolph fired once. Center mass. Landis staggered backward into the wall with an expression of pure surprise, the expression of someone who has made calculations for 20 years and has arrived at one. He got wrong. He slid down the wall and stayed there, breathing wounded alive, which was exactly what she needed him to be. The guard fired twice more. The second round hit her vest at the lower left side. The impact was like being struck with a hammer swung by someone who meant it. The air left her body in a single compression, and she felt the ribs on her left side flex in a way they were not designed to flex. Not broken, she told herself. She would learn 3 days later, looking at the imaging results in a Naval Medical Center examination room, that she had been wrong about this. 2 clean fractures, the 4th and 5th ribs on the left. The kind of injury a physician would describe as requiring 6 weeks of rest. She continued moving. She put 3 rounds into the guard from behind the table. He dropped. She turned. Fisk was gone. The door at the far end of the room was swinging closed on an automatic return. She stood in the room with the hard drives and the laptop and the wounded and the dead and breathed through the pain in her left side, treating it as data rather than experience. Then she began collecting the drives. Harker, she keyed the spare radio she had taken from the guard's vest. Landis is down, wounded alive. Rudolph is down. Fisk is running. He has an exit route. I have the drives. I'm in pursuit. Static. Then Harker's voice, and in it something she had not heard from him in 4 days, a quality adjacent to fear, but more specific than that. Negative, return to the egress point. We extract together. She was already moving toward the door Fisk had used. He has the archive backup, she said. If he leaves this compound with what's in his head, everything Thomas spent 27 years building is gone. Voss, that is a direct order. She pushed through the door. The tunnel beyond was concrete, functional, the infrastructure of a person who had 30 years and significant resources to prepare for the contingency of needing to disappear. Tell Thomas I finished it right, she said. She switched the radio to receive only and ran. Part 3, what Thomas started. She caught him at 300 meters. Not because she was faster than a man 38 years older than her across open desert terrain in the dark though she was. She caught him because the vehicle he had staged at the end of the dirt track would not start. She heard it from 200 meters away, an engine turning over without catching the mechanical equivalent of a door that looks like an exit and isn't. She heard it 4 times in the 8 seconds it took her to close from 200 meters to 100, and by the time she was at 75 meters, she could see him standing at the driver's door with his hand still on the key. She had tampered with it. 40 minutes before the cliff, she had circled wide through the northern scrub and found the Land Cruiser staged in the dark at the end of the track and removed the distributor cap and put it in her vest pocket. Thomas had taught her that every plan needed an ending you controlled, and that controlling an ending meant working backward from it before you worked forward through everything else. Fisk turned when he heard her footsteps. In the darkness with 60 meters between them and the cold Nevada wind moving through the scrub, they looked at each other for a moment. Then he ran. Not toward her and not away from her, but laterally toward a structure she had noted from the ridgeline, a low-profile single-room construction that looked like a utility shed and functioned as whatever the person who built it needed it to function as. He moved well for 68. He moved like someone who had maintained himself against exactly this requirement. She went after him and felt the ribs on her left side announce themselves with every impact of her right foot on the desert floor. She cataloged this information and continued running. He reached the structure 15 seconds ahead of her and went inside. She slowed at the door, stopped beside it, pressed her back against the exterior wall, and listened. Inside movement, a chair scraping equipment being accessed, the sound of a satellite radio handset being lifted. He was trying to call someone, and he had not yet located a weapon, or he would have used the time differently. She went through the door low and fast. The interior was a single room with a folding table, a satellite radio setup, 2 chairs, a battery lantern. Fisk had turned on when he entered, and a locked weapons case on the floor under the table. Fisk was at the radio table with the handset in his left hand and his right hand moving toward the case. He turned when she came through the door. She had the M4 up, center of mass, 12 feet between them. He stopped moving. His hand was 18 inches from the case. He set the handset down. "The vehicle," he said. "Distributor cap," she said. "Before the cliff." Something moved through his expression at the intersection of irritation and reluctant respect. "Thomas," he said. "Thomas," she agreed. The lantern light was yellow and unsteady. Outside, the compound behind her had entered its organized response. Alarms, vehicles, the sound of trained people executing a protocol they had prepared for. How long she had in this room was a calculation she ran continuously in the background, while the foreground stayed on Fisk. "You're going to tell me to put my hands up," he said. "I'm going to tell you to step away from the case and sit in the chair." He did both. He moved with the unhurried compliance of someone who has decided the immediate tactical situation is not where this conversation will be won or lost. He sat at the far end of the table and looked at her with the complete attention of a man who has spent decades reading people across tables and has gotten very good at it. She kept the rifle where it was, checked the weapons case without looking away from him. Combination lock, she left it. "Landis," he said. "Alive. He took 1 round center mass. He was wearing a vest." Of course he was. Gareth has always been careful. He said it without effect. "The others." "Displacing. They'll be clear." He nodded, slowly fitting information into a larger picture. "So the compound is compromised. Rudolph is dead. Landis is in custody for all practical purposes. And you're standing in front of me with a rifle and hard drives that contain 35 years of material that certain people very much need to remain unretrieved." He looked at her steadily. "How do you see this ending, Miss Voss?" "You're going to answer some questions," she said. "And then you're going to be taken into federal custody and spend the remainder of your life explaining yourself to people with the authority to listen." He was quiet for a moment. "Thomas," he said finally, "spent 27 years building a case. 27 years of living under a name that wasn't his, maintaining the discipline of a man who understood the work was going to take longer than he wanted it to take, and that impatience was the thing most likely to get him killed." He paused. "And he got close. Closer than I expected in 2011. He had narrowed it to 2 names, mine and Landis's. He was going to force a conclusion." Another pause. "So we forced one first. Route 2 outside Havre, a truck that came out of a side road without its lights on." She had known this, had known the mechanics of it for 3 years. Knowing it and hearing it stated in the flat declarative sentences of a man who was not ashamed of it were not the same experience. She breathed through the difference. "Panama," she said. 1987. 9 men. His expression did not change. 9 men died because a mission was built on intelligence I had modified. Yes. He said it the way you say things that exist entirely in the past and have been so thoroughly metabolized they no longer carry weight. The Panama operation presented a specific risk to the timeline. Eliminating the operation was necessary. 9 men. Were collateral to a larger objective. Yes. He looked at her. "I understand that's not an answer you find acceptable." I'm not offering it for acceptance. I'm offering it as the accurate description of what happened and why. She held the rifle where it was. Thomas did not compromise those men. He did not have enough to name you with certainty before Panama, and he was still building the case when it happened. Whatever you told yourself about his responsibility, whatever version of the story you've been carrying, he did not make a choice that got those men killed. You made that choice. Something moved through Fisk's expression, a quality she had not seen from him yet, the quality of a man who has been carrying a particular weight for so long, he has forgotten it is there until someone names it precisely. He said nothing. He spent 27 years trying to correct what he couldn't prevent, she said. You spent 35 years building something on top of it. Those aren't morally equivalent positions. I don't care how good your reasons were. The silence in the room had a texture. Then Fisk said, "You're going to want to know about Crane." She waited. "Before you take what's on those drives to the people who will receive them," he said. "Before Harker calls in the FBI and whoever else Crane has positioned to handle the incoming material, you need to understand what you're returning it to." He folded his hands on the table with the composure of a man delivering a briefing he has been preparing for some time. Maren Crane has been deputy director of the Central Intelligence Agency for 9 years. Before that, she ran the Black Budget Operations Division for 6 years. Before that, she spent 12 years in covert operations management. He looked at her. She built the architecture that became what I used to run this network. Not all of it. The foundation, the methodology, the understanding of how to use classified material as a long-term leverage instrument rather than an immediate operational resource. He paused. I came to her in 1988 with a proposal. She refined it. She taught me how to make it durable. And then she stepped back and let me run it and paid herself from the proceeds in ways not visible in the archive you're carrying. The lantern, the draft, the distant sound of the compound. She sent you here, he said. She briefed your team. She knew exactly what the archive contained because she helped design it. And she understood that if you retrieved it and brought it directly to her, she would have the opportunity to remove the material that implicated her before anyone else reviewed it. He held her gaze. The archive you're carrying contains 35 years of material, but the specific files documenting Crane's founding role in the original network structure are in a separate encrypted partition, one whose key only she holds. If you give those drives to Crane, that partition disappears. Everything else stays. She hands over enough to convict me, enough to satisfy a congressional inquiry, enough to close the books on Panama and the 6 men killed in the last 4 months. And the part that matters most is gone. Nora stood with the rifle and the pain in her left side and the drives in her pack and worked through what he had just told her. It had the structure of truth. That was not the same as being truth, and she understood the difference. A man in this position had every reason to construct something that had the structure of truth. She understood that. She also understood that the specific details, the partition, the second layer key, the timeline of Crane's involvement, were the kind of details that could be verified. The kind that, if fabricated, would fall apart under scrutiny quickly enough that inventing them would be a poor investment for a man of his intelligence. She pulled the satellite radio toward her, kept her eyes on him. If you're telling me the truth, the people who receive these drives need to know about the partition before Crane has access to them. Yes. If you're not telling me the truth, I'll know inside 48 hours. Yes, he said again. You will. She keyed the radio. Harker, I need a secure uplink, and I need you to route around Crane's office for the receipt of these drives. Trust me, and I'll explain when I'm standing in front of you. A pause. Then Harker's voice, carrying the quality of a man who has learned which moments require questions and which require the decision to simply move. Copy, uplink through Naval Intelligence Direct. Boise Field Office for physical receipt. Talk to me. What's Fisk's status? In custody. Wounded. She said the last part because, in the next 30 seconds, it was going to become a true or it was not, and the determination of which was not entirely in her hands. Fisk looked at her. In his eyes, she found what she had been looking for since she came through the door. The question of what kind of man he was in the last accounting. Not the operational version, not the one that had been making calculations for 35 years. The version underneath the one that existed before the network and the betrayals and the long construction of something built on the deaths of men who had trusted the institution that employed them both. She found her answer. He reached for the weapons case. She had seen it coming 2 seconds before it happened, seen it in the way his weight shifted and in the quality of the decision that moved across his face in the moment before his body acted. She had been hoping she was wrong. She was not wrong. She fired 3 rounds. The sound in the enclosed space was enormous. The rounds carried him backward off the chair and against the wall, and he slid down it slowly, and the weapons case remained on the floor under the table with its combination lock intact, and the room smelled of propellant and the copper and earth smell that combat medicine teaches you to recognize and never forget. She crossed to him, the rifle down her sidearm, out, both hands steady, because this was not the moment to be anything other than what she was. He was alive. For the moment. The rounds had done what they had done, and the outcome was clear to both of them. His breathing was labored. His eyes were open and clear and still sharp in the way they had been sharp all night, which she found she respected even now. The partition, she said, the access structure. He looked at her for a moment. Then he told her. She memorized it. She had been trained to memorize things by a man who believed the most secure storage was inside a person's mind, requiring no technology and immune to confiscation. Panama, she said. Their families. There are names in the main archive, he said. His voice was working harder. Complete service records. Enough to request posthumous recognition. All 9. He paused. I kept everything. I don't know why. I kept everything. She thought she might know why, but did not say so. Thomas, he said. She waited. He was the best of us. The best of all of us from that era. I'm not saying that to offer you something. I'm saying it because it's true and because there's no cost to truth at this point. He breathed. He was better than me. I always knew it. I built all of this partly because I understood I was never going to be what he was, and I decided to be something else instead. Another breath. I don't recommend it. He forgave harder things than this, she said. It was one of his limitations. Something in Fisk's expression shifted. Not a smile. The shadow of what a smile is made of before it becomes something you can name. He said nothing else. She stayed until it was finished. It did not take long. Then she stood, picked up the drives, keyed the satellite radio, and began transmitting. 6 hours later, in the first pale light of a Nevada morning, she was sitting on the open tailgate of the gray Ford F-250 at the staging point in the dry wash, holding a bottle of water she had been meaning to drink for the last 40 minutes and not drinking. Her left side had been field dressed by Harker, with the competence of a man who had applied field dressings in conditions that made this one look routine. The 2 fractured ribs had been confirmed by the pressure test. They were what they were. Harker stood nearby. Decker and Pruitt were at the second vehicle. Nobody was talking. The uplink had gone through at 0312. Naval Intelligence had the drives. The Boise field office had the partition access information transmitted through a channel that ran nowhere near Marin Crane's office. At 0611, Harker's phone rang. He listened for 90 seconds, said yes twice and understood once, and put the phone in his pocket. Crane was placed on administrative leave at 0530, he said. Full DOJ review initiated. They're treating the partition information as credible pending verification. He paused. Landis is in federal custody at Elko Regional. He'll need surgery, but he'll survive to answer for what he did. She nodded. Decker walked over from the second vehicle. He stood in front of her and looked at her with the expression of a man who has revised a significant assessment and is deciding how to account for the revision. He had been the skeptic. He had done his job correctly, which was to doubt until the evidence made doubt unsustainable. The evidence had done that. He had adjusted. This was the arc of a professional, and she respected it precisely because it had been earned through demonstration and not given by declaration. He did not make a speech. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out a single .338 Lapua Magnum round, held it out to her. She took it. He nodded once, turned, and walked back to the vehicle. She held the round in her palm for a moment. Then she put it in her vest pocket next to Thomas's journal where it would stay. She looked up at the sky over the Nevada desert, which was doing the thing that desert skies do in the early morning, becoming a color that has no good name in the vocabulary of places that have weather, a color entirely specific to high-altitude dry country in the hour before the sun clears the eastern range. She had seen this color in Colorado. She had seen it in Montana. Both times Thomas had been there. She opened the journal, not to read it. She had read every page enough times that the words had migrated off the paper and into whatever part of a person stores the things they carry forward permanently. She opened it because the weight of it in her hands was specific and real. And in this morning, with everything that the night had contained, specific and real, were what she needed. the last page. October 12th, 2011. She read the last 3 lines. Do not mourn long. Finish it. And then for the love of everything I tried to give you, live. That is the part I never found the time to teach you properly. I am sorry for that more than for anything else. She had read these lines perhaps 200 times across 3 years. They had meant different things at different readings. Comfort and instruction and accusation and permission in various measures depending on what she was carrying when she came to them. This morning they meant something she had not found in them before. They meant she was finished with the part that was his. The accounting was complete. The 27 years of work he had not lived to finish had been carried across the line by someone he had spent 15 summers making into the person who could carry it. The 9 men from Panama had names again, formal names attached to records that acknowledged what happened to them and why. The people responsible were dead or in the process of being held responsible by institutions with the authority to do so. The chapter that began in 1984, when Thomas Voss walked out of a hospital in Portsmouth and disappeared into the long work of fixing what had been broken, was closed. She closed the journal, held it for a moment, put it back inside her vest. Harker came and sat on the tailgate beside her, not close. The appropriate distance for 2 people who have built something real across a very short and very difficult period and are still in the process of understanding what it is. He said nothing for a while. Then Crane's people are going to push back on the partition evidence. She has resources. She has relationships inside the institution. This is going to be a long process. I know. The congressional inquiry into Panama, getting the families of the 9 men what they deserve. That's going to require someone to keep the pressure on when the institution starts looking for reasons to let it go quiet. I know that too. He was quiet again. The morning was coming over the Eastern Range. The instructor position, he said, Naval Special Warfare Center. I put your name in before we left Coronado. It was approved while we were in the field. The Navy is opening SEAL selection to women next year. Full integration, full standards, no separate track. They need instructors who understand what it takes to get through it and come out the other side as something useful. He paused. Not instructors who were told it was possible. Instructors who have demonstrated it. She thought about Thomas on a range in Colorado in the summer heat, spending 4 hours on one technique, never appearing to be anywhere else he would rather be. She thought about what it meant to receive that kind of patient instruction and what it might mean to give it. She thought about the difference between being a weapon and being the person who builds them, which was a different kind of work and perhaps a more durable one. On one condition, she said, name it. The partition information. The 1988 files on Crane. I want to be part of the review team, not an observer, a working member. I know the material better than anyone outside the network because Thomas built his investigation around the same material from the outside in. Harker looked at her for a moment. Done, he said. He stood, put his hand on her shoulder for exactly 1 second. Then he took it away and walked to the lead truck. 8 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning in November, when the sky over Arlington National Cemetery was the gray of late autumn and the trees had shed most of what they were going to shed, Nora Voss stood in front of a headstone set in the ground 14 days earlier. Thomas Allen Voss, United States Navy SEAL Team, 6 February. 4th, 1941, November 23, 2011. Navy Cross Honor, Courage, Commitment. The headstone was real. The dates were real. The name was the name he had been born with and carried for 43 years before circumstances required him to put it down and carry something else for a while. The Navy Cross had been awarded posthumously 6 weeks after the archived material was verified based on documentation of the Panama investigation that Thomas had built across 2 decades, and that was now part of the permanent record. It was not enough. It was what was available. Harker stood to her left in dress blues, Decker to her right. Pruitt further, right in his coat in his silence that had long since stopped being a characteristic and become simply the way he occupied the world. The ceremony had been small, which Thomas would have preferred, and in the morning, which he had always said was when serious things should happen because the day had not yet accumulated the weight that made judgment difficult. Nobody spoke for a while. Then Decker stepped forward. He moved with the deliberate quality of someone who has decided what they are going to do and is going to do it without ceremony, but with complete intention. He reached up to the collar of his dress uniform. His fingers found the Master Chief insignia on his right side, the device he had worn for 11 years, the medal that said, in the most compressed possible language, what 4 decades of service had made him. He worked it free. He held it for a moment in his palm, the way you hold something before you give it away for the last time. Then he set it on the top edge of the headstone in the groove between the granite and the sky, and he stepped back and put his hands in his coat pockets and looked at the name below it. He had earned that insignia across 40 years of work that Thomas Voss would have recognized and respected. Leaving it here was not a loss. It was a placement, a statement in the language of men who communicate through objects and silence and the precise arrangement of small things that said, this man was worth the best of what I had to give. Pruitt produced from inside his coat a photograph. 8 weeks ago, the night before they deployed, Nora had handed it to him without explanation, and he had taken it without asking why, because Pruitt had long since learned that the things worth keeping were the things people gave you when they didn't have to. He set it against the base of the headstone, weighted by a small stone against the November wind. The girl and the old man in the Colorado mountains. He looked at the image for a moment. Then he straightened and looked at the middle distance with the expression of a man completing a very long piece of work and taking a moment to understand that it is finished. Harker stood with his hands clasped behind his back and looked at the name on the stone with the expression of a man in a long conversation with a person who can no longer answer, which is not the same as a one-sided conversation. It is in its own way the most honest kind. Nora knelt. She pressed her palm flat against the base of the headstone the way she had pressed it against the desert floor before the range test, before the cliff, before all of it. The stone was cold. November cold, the cold of something that has been outside long enough to become the same temperature as the air around it. She held her palm there and felt the cold move into her hand and up her wrist and let it. She did not speak out loud. What she said was said inside her in the part of a person where the things that matter most are kept, and it was brief because Thomas had always taught her that the most important things were brief. That precision was a form of respect. That saying only what needed to be said was how you demonstrated that you understood what you were saying. She said, I finished it right. She stood. The four of them stood together for another minute in the gray November morning with the trees around them and the traffic on the Memorial Bridge in the middle distance and the quiet of a place that has absorbed a very great deal of loss over a very long time and has learned to hold it without being diminished by it. Then Harker said, come on, first round is mine. They walked. Nora fell in beside Decker, who matched her pace without adjusting it, which happens only between people who have been through something together and come out the other side in a configuration neither of them would have predicted at the start. At the gate, her phone vibrated. Unknown number. The message was 6 sentences. Crane is in custody. The review is moving. But the partition files reference a name that predates Crane's involvement by 11 years. A name Thomas identified in 1979 before SEAL Team 6 existed and then lost when the documentation was destroyed. That name is still active. That person is still in position. The 1979 files are in a location Thomas marked in the margin of page 31. He was waiting until he was sure he could trust the person reading them. He decided in the end to trust you, someone who was there before any of this started. She read the message twice. Page 31. The sequence of 6 numbers and a single word in ink that was a slightly different shade than the surrounding text written at a different time than the original entry in handwriting, smaller and more careful than Thomas's usual style. She had always taken it for a reference notation, had read past it hundreds of times with the assumption that she understood what it was. She had not understood what it was. She understood now. She looked up. The cemetery stretched away in every direction, the gray headstones in their long, orderly rows, the trees, the November grass. 200 meters away near the tree line on the western edge, a figure stood between 2 headstones. Female. Still, far enough away that details were impressions rather than facts. In the time it took Nora to look and register what she was seeing, the figure turned and walked into the trees and was gone. Harker had seen her stop. He came up beside her and followed her gaze to the empty tree line. Anything, he said. She put the phone in her pocket. Not yet, she said. Decker and Pruitt had paused. They were watching her with the specific attention of people who have learned to read the quality of another person's stillness and understand that this particular stillness means something is beginning rather than ending. She looked at each of them in turn. Then she began to walk. Not quickly, not with urgency, the way Thomas had taught her to move toward things that required her full attention, which was steadily with intention, with the bearing of someone who has already made the decision and is simply covering the ground between the decision and what it requires. Harker fell in beside her, Decker on the other side. Pruitt, without being asked, moved to their left flank because Pruitt had always known his role so completely that it had long since become instinct rather than assignment, which was how Thomas had always said the best service happened. Behind them, the headstone stood in the November morning with Decker's insignia on its edge, and the photograph at its base and the name that had been restored to the record it had always belonged in. Some distances are not closed in the telling of a single story. Thomas had known this, had built his entire life around the understanding that the work worth doing was never the work that finished in a single lifetime, that what you left behind mattered more than what you completed, that the person standing at the edge of the next thing was the truest measure of everything that had come before. Nora Voss walked out of Arlington on a gray Tuesday morning in November with the journal against her chest and the knowledge of page 31 in her mind, and three men at her back who had decided without being asked and without ceremony that where she was going was where they were going too. She had been taught that the most important things were brief. This was one of them. She kept walking.